Hello and welcome to the Poetry Show. This is going to be the first episode of the Poetry Show, so it's going to be a little bit rusty. Not quite sure what the format's going to be. It's probably just going to be me talking about poems that I like, but that's good with me. The first thing I was going to do, I was going to discuss this book. This is Ted Hughes' New Selected Poems from 1957 to 1994. Now, it doesn't really contain anything from Tales from Ovid, and it doesn't really contain anything from the birthday letters, or there's a few things from both of those in here, because this was before he died really, and it's a collection of like his best of, before then. And the reason I'm particularly interested in this book is because this is the book that first got me into poetry all those years ago. And the reason this book was the first book that got me into poetry was because of this picture. You see, when this book, or when I first became aware of this book, it was shortly after Ted Hughes had died in 1998. And I'd hated poetry. All the way through school, we were looking at poems by U.A. Fanthorpe, one poem in particular, Not My Best Side. This was like classed as one of the greatest poems that we would read for my GCSE. And GCSE poetry courses in England aren't particularly good. So we were reading these poems and they were terrible, and it just put me off poetry for a long time at least. And then one day I was watching this tribute to Ted Hughes, who had died. As I say, this was in about 1998. And it was absolutely crazy, but he looked exactly the same. In this particular photo that was shown on his obituary programme, he looked exactly the same as my grandfather on my dad's side. And he'd only passed away a few years before that, or even about that year, I think. It wasn't, I forget the timing of when it all happened. He might have been a year or two before it, even maybe. But seeing this image of like my granddad on telly was kind of weird. And there were clips of Ted Hughes talking about this poem, The Thought Fox, that he'd written. And he told the story about how he'd come about writing it and the process he'd gone through. And I found that really interesting because it was something that I could kind of relate to, this idea of having these ideas and then kind of shaping them and the way these happen. And he talked about, he wrote this poem and it didn't go the way he planned, and then he went to bed. He had this really weird dream where fox came and touched the poem that he'd written and it went up in flames. Then when he woke up, he got up and he wrote what was later known as The Thought Fox. And The Thought Fox, the people that don't really know Ted Hughes, chances are if they know any Ted Hughes at all, that's going to be the one they know. So that was the first one I knew, and I thought for your delectation and delight, I would read it to you. Because I'm not quite sure what we're going to do on the poetry show yet, so this might be it. Anyway, The Thought Fox by Ted Hughes. I imagine this midnight's moment's forest, something else is alive beside the clock's loneliness, and this blank page where my fingers move. Through the window I see no star. Something more near though, deeper within darkness, is entering the loneliness. Cold, delicately as the dark snow, a fox's nose touches twig, leaf. Two eyes serve a movement that now, and again now, and now, and now, set neat prints into the snow, between trees, and warily a lame shadow lags by a stump, and in hollow of a body that is bold to come across clearings, an eye, a widening, deepening greenness, brilliantly, concentratedly, coming about its own business, till, with a sudden sharp hot stink of fox, it enters the dark hole of the head. The window is starless still. The clock ticks. The page is printed. Now, I've got to be honest, I probably first read that poem, 98, when I was 16, 17. And when I read this poem, I wanted to like it. I wanted to. The guy that wrote it looked like my fairly recently deceased grandfather, and I wanted to like it. I wanted to like him. So I kind of told myself I did. Now I can't pretend for 1 second that when I was a 16-year-old boy I understood what this poem was about in the least. And for me to even try to explain it now, I'm not sure I could do that. But I told myself I liked it, and I convinced myself I liked it, so I liked it. And there's a lot to be said for trying to trick yourself into these kinds of things, because I've got to say, even though I didn't really understand it at the time, and even though I was only pretending to myself to like it, it's not even as though I then went around wearing a beret pretending to be some, newfound creative intellectual type, and I'd only go around discussing poetry and possibly smoking French cigarettes. I wasn't that kind of tossy, and I didn't go in for that kind of thing by any stretch of the imagination, but I convinced myself that I liked poetry, or at least that I liked Ted Hughes. And that's how I got into poetry, and now I have a poetry collection that I'm going to be sharing with you. I'm going to be reading you a lot of these poems, but I think the thing I wanted to get across in this first poetry show is that poetry isn't difficult and it's not weird. It can be beautiful. The sounds themselves can be enough to win you over even when you don't understand, maybe at first reading, what it's about. But also, it isn't what you're taught at school, what poetry is. Often what we learn at school about poetry, and I know this for a fact because I am an English teacher, one of the things that we tend to teach, sometimes against our will, is this idea of, what did the poet mean by this? What does this mean? What's your interpretation of this? And we ask kids these things. And when I was 16, if you'd asked me my interpretation of that poem, I just would have told you that it was about a fox. A thought fox, possibly imaginary. Something about a leaf. Well, I knew leaf could be paper as well. There's some sort of illusion I could draw there. But it kind of saps the joy out of it. And I personally find poetry incredibly joyful, and I'm going to hope that I can bring a little bit of that joy to other people. And if I'm not doing that in my classroom, then I'm going to try and do it here on YouTube. Anyway, I just wanted to share that poem with you for the first time, and to point out that not everybody that has an interest in poetry does so because they understand meter, rhythm, assonance, consonance, alliteration, onomatopoeia necessarily, but sometimes, and only because, the guy that wrote the poems in the first place looks like someone they know. And that's a perfectly good reason to like poetry too. So that's all for this episode of the Poetry Show, with absolutely no poetry criticism whatsoever, although that will come. Thanks for watching, and I hope you enjoy the future episodes. Bye.